A woman who died 20 years ago came to the funeral of her son. What happened then shocked everyone. Maria flipped open her cell phone and looked at the screen. It took a while for the device to log into the mobile network. She hadn't expected it to work at all after 20 years. But the little device connected without a hitch and updated the date. It was November 21st, 2056. It was already dawn, but she still put on her sunglasses. She didn't want to be recognized. Then she entered the cemetery of her home village. A shiver ran down the woman's spine when she came to an open grave. The gravediggers had just come to the graveside from the chapel. It was her son who was to be buried here, right next to her own grave, as they had arranged long ago. Another gravesite was still vacant. This meant that her husband was still alive. Mary was relieved because otherwise her plan would not have worked. She glanced at her gravestone. She had been dead for 20 years. But she had time to think about it. The gravediggers lifted her son's coffin. "My boy," Maria whispered. She didn't want the mourners to hear her, but she had spoken too loudly. "Did you know the young man?" asked one of those present. "He was a good friend," Maria lied. She pulled her headscarf deeper into her forehead. On her tombstone was a photograph of her. If anyone recognized her, there would be quite a mess, and she didn't have much time. "Please," Maria said, pulling a silver cross from her pocket, "I would like to place this in his coffin." The mourners froze. The coffin was already closed. "It belonged to his grandmother," Maria lied again. "He gave it to me once. Now I want him to keep it with him." She got the cross from a junk store. It was just a pretext. The mourners whispered. They concluded that the unknown woman must be an ex-girlfriend of the deceased soldier. Finally, the gravediggers opened the coffin a crack, just wide enough so Maria could place the jewelry on her son's chest. She quickly reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a note. "Sorry, boy," she whispered so softly that this time no one could understand. Then the coffin was lowered into the pit. Mary fled the place. Seeing her son's funeral and then her own grave was too much. Planning a time travel was one thing. To experience it was quite another. Quickly, Maria went down to her village. She looked at her watch. She had only a half an hour left. Now it was time to find her husband's house. Fortunately, Mark was not someone who particularly appreciated change. As expected, he had not moved in all these years. Maria had also not been surprised that her husband did not attend his son's funeral. He never went to funerals. "There's nothing left for the dead," he always said in a stubborn way. "We have to be there for the living." He probably hadn't even been to her funeral, she reflected, and he was right. She would have none of it. Mary knocked on the door. No one answered. She pushed down the handle. The door was not locked. Quite careless for a general, she thought. Then she entered the house. She saw her husband sitting in a wheelchair in front of the fireplace. He had grown old, of course. It had been 20 years since they had last seen each other. She approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. "Please don't be startled," she said. He didn't even flinch. He was a soldier through and through with ice water in his blood. "What do you want?" he asked. "Leave before I call the police." Apparently, he didn't recognize her. "It's about your son," Maria replied. Mark made a gruff motion. "What's the difference? He's dead. Out. Over," he replied. Maria noticed the bottle of whiskey next to his wheelchair. It was almost empty. "He can still be saved," she said. With a jerk, her husband spun his wheelchair around and looked her straight in the face. She realized immediately that one of his infamous rants was about to break out. But he hesitated. "Do we know each other?" he finally asked. Then she pointed to a photo of herself that was on the mantelpiece. Then she took off her headscarf and sunglasses. His eyes widened in horror. "Don't worry, I'm not a ghost," Maria tried to reassure him. She had never seen her husband in fear. "But how? You're dead," he stammered. "I'm afraid that's true, honey. I've seen my grave, she smiled. But it wasn't me 20 years ago. I went back in time, she explained. They had never talked about her work, but Mark darkly remembered that she had once hinted at something like that. Maria had been a scientist and had worked on top-secret projects. Now she told him that she had succeeded in inventing the time machine. First, they tested the device with objects. A ball and a stuffed teddy disappeared into the future before their eyes and returned after an hour. The same thing happened with animals. They could send them far into the future, decades or even centuries, but they always returned after an hour. No one can stay in the future longer than an hour, including me, Maria said. She looked at her watch. I have only 10 minutes now, she said. 10 minutes to save our son. What should I do? Asked Mark. Mary showed him the note her dead boy had carried in the coffin. It was a tradition in his unit to write down the time of death and the coordinates of the place of death and give it to the fallen. Mark, of course, knew. Their boy had advanced on an enemy position with his unit a week ago. He was on the front lines and was one of the first to die in machine gun fire. It can't be helped now, can it? Asked Mark. Maybe it can, Maria replied. When I get back, I'll make him take an oath. She was going to make her son promise to fast for a whole week before the 20th anniversary of her death. He would think it strange, but he would keep it. It was, after all, her last will. I saw the date on my tombstone, she said. I die shortly after returning from this time. A side effect of time travel, I'm sure. Mark nodded. Officially, you had a heart attack. Maria realized she could not make another trip. This was her only chance. She fervently hoped that she could talk to her son one more time to take the promise from him. If my journey was successful, our son will finish his fast at this moment and advance on the enemy position, Maria said. You are a general, after all, and you now have the coordinates. Order air support. Mark promised in tears, for he realized that in a few moments he would lose his wife a second time. He even managed to get out of his wheelchair and hug her, so they held each other tightly until she disappeared very slowly. I hope you made it, Mark whispered. He picked up the phone and gave the coordinates with the mission order. It must have all seemed very strange to the Air Force men, but they were used to receiving orders and not asking questions. They would cover the enemy position with missiles. Mark waited on the phone for endless minutes. Done, it then sounded from the other end of the line. He hung up and made his way to the cemetery in his wheelchair. He found his wife's grave and realized what a sacrifice she had made. She could have used her time travel to save herself. In a very distant future, she surely could have helped to mitigate the deadly effects of time travel, but she had chosen otherwise. Relieved, he noted that there was no open grave next to hers. You did it, he whispered. Our son is still alive. At that moment, his cell phone rang. He heard his son John's voice. He had just learned that his father had given the order to deploy and saved many men from his unit in the process. How did you know? Asked John. Or is that classified? Mark answered with a counter-question. How was your week of fasting? Now John was confused, for he had never told his father about the strange promise he had made to his mother on the day she died. The promise to fast for a week before the 20th anniversary of her death. It had taken some effort to explain the whole thing to his unit. But the men stuck together like peas and carrots. Finally, they supported him, not realizing that they were not only saving his life, but their own as well. Come home, boy, was all Mark said. I'll tell you everything, I promise. I can't promise you'll believe it all, though. Have you heard of people being inexplicably saved? Do you think time travel may play a role in this?